Hello, and welcome to episode 191, all about the adventures of Tom Bombadil, being the 191st part of That's What I'm Tolkien About. Hello, my name is Mary Clay. If that's too complicated for you, just call me MC. I've been experiencing the world of Tolkien for the first time, and I've gone just about as far down that rabbit hole as I want to at this point, and now I'm doing whatever I want. Welcome to this week's episode of Where in the World is Mike Schubert?
Yes, it is a joy to be here. I'm currently recording from Copenhagen, Denmark. This is the first time I've ever been here. I'm currently on tour with Potterless and the News Olympian, and I'm glad to hear you've reached this point with Tolkien that I reached with Harry Potter, which was once you finish the main stuff, you kind of have free reign to do whatever you want to do. And it's very freeing. And for me, it timed really well where I was getting into fan-made material just as J.K. Rowling was being really transphobic on Twitter. So then I got to feel still okay about the content that I was doing while I stuck around for a year to put her on blast every single episode for a year. And then I was like, okay, now I'm gone. So yeah, I'm glad you've reached this point. This is the fun, like, yeah, let's do this. And I think it's great. Congratulations on reaching this point.
Yes, thank you. I would say I technically reached that point at the beginning of last year. I had finished The Hobbit and the Hobbit movies, and then I started doing like a whole bunch of random stuff. Actually, some of which I will bring up. And then I read The Silmarillion. Which was more for saying I read The Silmarillion than I actually wanted to read The Silmarillion. But that fully broke me. And so now officially I'm like, I'm not reading any more of Tolkien beyond this little book of poems called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil.
Yes, which I am excited and was excited when I was offered to cover this as your guest for this episode. And I'm now starting to see the light of why Kelly, my wife, who I think we discussed this when we were on the pod way back, when I was like, yeah, Tom Bombadil seems great. She's like, you're only saying that because of his yellow boots. And I was like, yeah. And now after reading these poems, I can kind of see it. Because once you get past the yellow boots, it's not as much fun.
See, I enjoy that he is just his own person, you know? He's just kind of floating around the universe doing his own thing. And like the rest of the world is just along for the ride, you know? And
they really are.
I can respect that. So I wanted to bring on someone who had shown previous interest in Tom Bombadil rather than someone who would be like, Tom Bombadil is like the worst or whatever. And just, you know, here to, I don't know, have a little bit of silliness, partake in that.
I'm here for it. And I think this is the perfect situation for it because I have no full knowledge of Tom Bombadil. Like, I have not read the actual books. I've seen the movies. I've even seen the extended editions. So my knowledge of Tom Bombadil basically starts and ends with this. I know a little bit just in terms of how he's supposed to be really powerful and all of that. That doesn't really seem to come through in these poems, which I was thinking that it might, but nah, he's just kind of vibing. There's just lots of vibes in these poems.
Yes, vibes, good vibes only, truthfully. It's funny that you say you don't really know much about Tom Bombadil. I would argue that after reading these poems, you know more about Tom Bombadil than a lot of people do because
all right.
So I'll get into it now. Who is Tom Bombadil? Great question. Tom Bombadil is, as Tolkien described himself, a mystery and an enigma. After Lord of the Rings, people would write to him, and in published letters, he says to in a couple different places, he doesn't see that there's much point in philosophizing. I don't know how to say that word, but that's what he wrote.
I think you got it, yeah.
Philosophizing about Tom Bombadil, and that he preferred to leave Tom as a mystery because in mythology, there are parts of the story that are just enigmas with no explanation.
See, that sounds a little bit like when writers take the easy way out. And I think that there's some more guilty of this than others. And sometimes it can be thematic, but I'm thinking of sometimes when the narrator in a YA series will say, "It was so gruesome, I couldn't even describe it," or "It was so confusing, I couldn't even describe it," or "We made it through and I don't even know how." It's like, I feel like you probably do, and maybe you could try. So I
Mm-hmm.
feel maybe that's a way of being like, "Oh, Tom, some things are just better left unsaid." Like, no, you've created the character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, that's where I do kind of agree, because my personal opinion is that Tolkien wrote Tom Bombadil and was like, I'm just going to put in this chapter about this like random character who
Hmm.
wears yellow boots and rescues our hobbits. And they have quite a trip at his house. And then later he realized, oh no, I kind of made him low key all powerful.
Hmm.
And he's just like a spirit of the woods. And I can't have that exist in this story about like needing to destroy a giant evil power.
Hmm.
And so his explanation later on, when our characters at some point in the book in the Council of Elrond, one of them says something about, why don't we get Tom Bombadil to help us?
Hmm.
And Gandalf says, oh, he wouldn't be concerned about anything beyond the borders of his forest. He would just get bored and like get distracted and leave. He wouldn't want to do this. And
And
that
that's
was his
something
explanation.
that's something actually I was talking to Kelly before doing this episode, just mentioning, her thoughts on Tom Bombadil. And she was saying, and whether Tolkien meant this or not, it is an interesting thought where you have someone who has the ability and the power to truly make a difference, but they
Does
don't
it?
because they aren't concerned, which I think speaks highly of some of the other characters where they have the power to help and then they do, or even in some cases, people are in over their heads, but they have the desire and they want to help, even though they don't have the same power as someone like him would. So I think in that lens, I can kind of see it as an interesting way of saying, look at these characters that you love, look at the people who actually put in the effort to save the world, even though they are not magical, yellow booted, feather
Mm-hmm.
hatted spirits of the forest. They're still fighting it through. So yeah, let's show some more love to the folks from the fellowship that we know and love. So in that lens, I think it's kind of nice to use him as a way to make us appreciate the characters that we already like.
Yes, absolutely. Great point. Yeah, so I would, if it weren't for the fact that Tolkien does explain essentially every other detail in this universe, like in a way that I tweeted recently that one part of being a Tolkien creator that is a little disappointing is that there's not really room for fun theories
Mm,
like there are with, say, Harry Potter, where
yeah.
whether on purpose or not, there are just kind of like gaps in the story and they're not as thoughtfully filled in
Sure.
by the author. But that does allow for like fun fandom things to come about. And not to say that there aren't fun fandom parts of Tolkien, but it's kind of like you can't really theorize too much because in some footnote of a letter that he wrote to like his neighbor's second cousin, there is an explanation for whatever you're theorizing about. It just seems that Tom Bombadil is the one exception to that, and Tolkien apparently claims that is on purpose.
Then honestly, maybe I do believe him. I think that's, though it has some lack of interest in terms of your angle of being a creator in the space, I do think it does avoid the thing which I found frustrating when I was doing Harry Potter stuff. It is fun to theorize for some of the things that are left open ended, but I think sometimes it can get into the territory where people were giving J.K. Rowling way too much credit. Like people would come up
Oh
with these
yeah.
incredible fan theories and then they'd be like, I bet J.K. Rowling was thinking this. It's like, no, she probably
No, she
wasn't.
wasn't.
A lot of times she just forgot stuff or the plot made this change and all these sorts of things. Like you thought of that on your own. Give yourself credit. I don't think that J.K. Rowling needs to always get credit as this master genius. I don't think that's the case. And I think that at least you don't have to have that with Tolkien,
Yes.
where he's explained stuff so you know what did he think
Hmm.
of, what didn't he think of, and you know what? After that explanation, maybe he did really mean to leave Tom Bombadil ambiguous, and it was
Yeah,
all
I don't
part of the
I don't
plan.
know. I know. So Tom Bombadil, the idea for this character started as early as 1931. And actually, I should have looked up when was The Hobbit published. But this was definitely, 1937. So Tom Bombadil came to him as a character before even The Hobbit was written.
Wow.
He wrote him into a poem as he was kind of apt to do based on his children's toys. And there was one of his kids' toys named Tom. And so he wrote a poem. I don't know if it was like specifically for his children, or if it was like, oh, that gave me an idea for a poem that I'll write on my own. But he wrote a poem about Tom Bombadil. And it was published in February of 1934 in Oxford Magazine as The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. So that is kind of his first appearance, his origin stories. And then later on, after the publication and success of Lord of the Rings, we have Tolkien's Aunt Jane Neve to thank for this. Aunt Jane was writing to Tolkien and expressed, interest in Tom and said, I think this would make do you have any other stories about him? I think it would make for a great little Christmas present if you published a book where Tom Bombadil is like the main character. And Tolkien wrote to his publishers, who were naturally like, hey, Lord of the Rings did great. Got any more ideas? And he's like, actually, it was proposed to me to do something with Tom Bombadil. And I think it would make for a really nice book if it was paired with illustrations from Pauline Baynes. Okay. So that's kind of how this came about. They thought it would be like obviously not a cohesive story, and Tolkien did have a lot of he has to have an in-verse explanation for everything. Okay. And so to him, he was like, I can't just publish a book of random poems that I wrote. They have to connect to Middle Earth somehow. There has to be an explanation for why this book is being published in relation to Middle Earth. And it wouldn't even be he couldn't even do I just want to make a children's book and here's a completely different thing. If it had any kind of connection to Middle Earth, he's like, I have to explain why it exists in the universe.
I can respect that. I like him trying to keep everything, in line, have all these different ties. On the flip side, I do find it funny, and that just makes me wonder if this will ever happen. Just one of those things where some particular creator becomes so famous that anything they do becomes published, whether it's letters or, in I guess our case now, later and later with emails and text messages. It would be weird if it was like, oh yeah, one time this famous person that happened to be friends with Mike Schubert one time sent this email, and then it's put in a museum and it's me making a bad joke or something, and then it's immortalized forever because my friend became a world famous movie producer.
I know. Yeah, I would love to read some Actually, no, I take that back. I take it back. I didn't even say it, and I already take it back. I was going to say I would love to read some tweets from Tolkien, but seeing how that went for another author, no, I still stand by my statement that I'm glad Tolkien's dead.
But it would be fun if it was Tolkien wrote this passive-aggressive note to someone who kept parking in his driveway.
Yeah. I haven't gone into... there is a book of Tolkien letters, and I'm pretty sure there is a lot of passive aggression about stuff in those letters. In particular, I know he had some kind of commentary on I think it was in the 60s or early 70s. There was an attempt at a first Lord of the Rings movie script, and it was buck wild, to say the least. And Tolkien, it was sent to him or something, or somehow he read it, and he had a lot to say about it. And so stuff like that I know has been published.
Cool.
But I think you know, you kind of said that jokingly, but I do genuinely think anything that Tolkien wrote, people either have published or there are deals to publish it in the future.
Amazing. Tolkien's grocery lists brought to you by Penguin
Literally.
Random House.
In November of 1962, this little book of poems called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil was published. And Tolkien's explanation for these poems, that in-universe explanation, is that these are stories that Bilbo and Sam would have written in the Red Book. So the Red Book is what Bilbo wrote his adventures about the Hobbit in, and then later he continues it in Rivendell, and eventually I think he passes it on to Frodo, and then Frodo, they get home from the ring and everything, and he completes their story. And when he leaves for the Undying Lands, he leaves the book behind for Sam to continue writing in. So that is the explanation for what these stories are. It's kind of like little folklore stories that are being told in the Shire. And that's how so there's the book, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which has all these it has like a whole bunch of other poems and stories in it. And then there's the poem, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And then a poem after that one is called Bombadil Goes Boating. Yeah. And so those are the poems that deal specifically with Tom Bombadil and that we will talk about today. But first, who is Tom Bombadil? Well, if you were to ask Goldberry, his wife, she would simply say, he is. Because that is what Frodo asks her, and it's a very frustrating answer. They're very vague about like who exactly this insane man is that's kind of like low-key kidnapped them in the middle of the forest and been like, nah, everything's fine. I'm a jolly fellow. Here's my hot wood nymph wife, river nymph. Aren't we having a grand old time? So yeah, Frodo first asks, who is Tom Bombadil? And she just replies, he is. And then kind of goes on to say, he is the master of wood, water, and hill. And then Tom Bombadil later says about himself, speaking in himself like in third person.
Sure.
So take that for what you will.
As you do, as one does, yeah.
Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the Barrow-wights. When the elves passed westward, Tom was already here, before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside. So his history theoretically goes all the way back to what is essentially the creation of Arda, which is the world that Middle-earth exists in.
Okay.
And theoretically, he has been there since the first coming of the Dark Lord Melkor, who eventually has a servant named Sauron, and then Sauron obviously becomes our next main villain.
So is Tom Bombadil showing up in all the prequel stuff that's coming out, like the Rings of Power and all of that? Or he could have been. He was around, but he's not in the
So
stories.
that's what I and I think there are some other people who desperately want to see Tom Bombadil in the Rings of Power show. It would be really, really great. There's a plot line in the first season where a character crashes to Earth in a meteor. And some people...
Let's go.
Some people were theorizing at first that it would be Tom Bombadil, and throughout the first season, he's just referred to as the Stranger.
Yeah, it's like the big guy, right?
Yeah. Okay. But spoiler alert, by the end of season 1, it's learned that he is a wizard, and it's implied that it's Gandalf. I think there's a small chance it could be Saruman, but it is not Tom Bombadil, as I was like, that's gotta be him, right? That's Tom Bombadil.
Yeah, I didn't watch this intently, but while Kelly and I were traveling through New Zealand, of all places, she was watching The Rings of Power, and I just was glancing at it from the background and stuff, and I knew it was designed very much, you were trying to guess who was who. And she was very early in on guessing that this guy was Gandalf. And spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't watched the show. But right away, the guy who turned out to be Sauron, like first kind of episode with him in it, I was like, this guy's way too angry. This has to be Sauron. And the guy was like, ah. And then as it went on, she was like, I think, yeah. And then it turned out to be him. So I felt very good just by like, I paid attention to one scene and I was like, he was really angry. I think that might be the bad guy.
Yeah, I think this guy who just like suddenly snapped after being mildly provoked and absolutely
exactly the scene
murdering people in an alleyway.
I was
Maybe
like,
he's a bad guy.
I was like, yeah, I mean, I could get being upset, but I think he certainly
that
escalated
was
that a bit
that
far.
was definitely kind of the first little I would say first official hint to his real identity.
Sure.
Yeah, I would really love it if they incorporate him into the show. But because Tolkien, said, I prefer to leave him as a mystery and an enigma, I feel like they won't want to touch him because Tolkien wanted to leave him alone or something. I don't know.
Sure.
So that's kind of why, everything that I just read, those little like passages from the book and like these poems, this is the collective information that we have about Tom Bombadil.
Got it.
And now as much as I do.
I am the foremost expert, tied for first with you.
Yes. So now, jumping into these poems, the first one, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, just kind of following him throughout his day in the Old Forest, low-key just like being harassed by people who just like need to mind their business. And that's also kind of the theme of the Bombadil Goes Boating poem as well. So The Adventures of Tom Bombadil opens with I think this would make like aside from maybe the ending with Goldberry, I think this would make for a great little children's book,
Totally. The whole vibes certainly felt like it.
Yeah. Old Tom Bombadil was a merry fellow. Bright blue his jacket was, and his boots were yellow. Green were his girdle, and his breeches all of leather. He wore in his tall hat a swan wing feather. He lived up under hill, where the Withywindle ran from a grassy well down into the dingle. Old Tom in summertime walked about the meadows, gathering the buttercups, running after shadows, tickling the bumblebees that buzzed among the flowers, sitting by the waterside for hours upon hours. It really is good vibes only with
Good
this
vibes.
man.
Just vibes. Just absolutely vibing. Big nature boy. You love to see it.
Yeah. And actually, that was something that I forgot to include in my notes, but Tolkien originally described Tom Bombadil as like the spirit of the disappearing Oxford countryside.
Okay.
Yeah, so big so like, Tom Bombadil like coexisting among nature definitely like kind of goes along with that theme of like appreciating nature, and then Tolkien in real life is, watching it disappear as it like gives way to industrialization and modernization and whatnot. Especially if he was writing this in 1931.
Right.
So Tom Bombadil is looking into the river, and then all of a sudden comes up Goldberry, the river woman's daughter. And she kind of like teases and splashes him and gets his hat and boots all wet. And then Tom Bombadil says like, leave me alone, go to sleep. And then she goes back under the water. Then Tom Bombadil is kind of hypnotized by Old Man Willow, who is a tree. And this is actually the same tree that he does the same thing to the hobbits in the Fellowship of the Ring when Tom Bombadil comes and saves them, where he sings and it kind of lulls Tom to sleep, and then he like engulfs him in his trunk and roots.
Mm-hmm.
And then Tom Bombadil like wakes up and is like, now you let me go. And then he does. So this is kind of where I guess we're learning that Tom seems to have, like Goldberry said to Frodo, he is a master of wood, water, and wind or something.
Sure.
Whatever I said earlier. So he gets released from the tree. He's on his way home when it starts raining, and he tries to take refuge in a badger hole. And then a family of badgers kidnap him and drag them into their tunnels. And he's like, now you let me out. And they let him out. And then he goes home and finds a Barrow Wight hiding upstairs. Now, I don't know if when Tolkien, obviously, so he wrote this first. He wrote this before The Hobbit and before Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings and later in the appendices, actually, we learn more about the Barrow Wights, and
Okay.
they're way more sinister and creepy.
Mm.
And then there's just like one casually hiding upstairs in Tom Bombadil's house. So
Okay.
I don't know if Tolkien like knew that, you know, a Barrow Wight would later on become this like really creepy kind of like ghoul goblin thing.
Mm. Yeah, okay. No, now I have to kind of like reset my reading and imagine this is because when I was reading this, I don't know what this thing is. Certainly not exactly what I had pictured. Need to ramp up the fear factor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like you wouldn't, there's no way that like anyone reading this, you know, without having read Fellowship or like these specific details that like this is where I'm like, oh, I've become the people that I used to get annoyed by, where I'm like, I know all these minute details.
Look, but it's part of the process of doing this is that it's not about knowing the details, it's how you share them. And I will say that the way
so
you just
true.
shared them was not very well actually. It was just actually, which is it's a key difference when you have the pause after the comma.
Yes, that's a great way to think about it. I actually I just posted an Instagram reel where I was kind of doing that. I was like, oh well, I almost said well actually.
I mean,
fun fact, you know, in the book this is how it happens, and let me share it with you because I enjoy it and I want other people to enjoy it.
Yeah.
The Barrow Wights way back before way before the events of The Hobbit, even there were this would have been before the first like War of the Ring, before the prologue of Lord of the Rings, where they're having that battle and what's his face, Sauron's finger gets cut off with the ring.
Yeah.
So that has yet to happen, and so there's still all these like battles and whatnot happening. And then kind of in the land over near the Shire, there's a battle and a bunch of men die and they're buried there. And then Nazgul, the Witch King, actually I think comes over and like curses that land. And so the Barrow Wights are these like cursed beings that I can't remember if the Barrow Wights are actually the men that were buried there, or if it's just like ghosts around this like burial ground. But it has like a much darker history than it does in this little poem where he comes upstairs. Let me find it. Where he comes upstairs and he opens the door and it says, "Whoo, Tom Bombadil, look what night has brought you. I'm behind the door. Now at last I've caught you. You'd forgotten Barrow Wight dwelling in the old mound up there on hilltop with the ring of stones round." So that's kind of like the graveyard burial, whatever. "He got loose again. Under earth he'll take you. Poor Tom Bombadil, pale and cold he'll make you." So that's definitely V creepy, but he also opens with, "Whoo, Tom Bombadil, now I've caught you." I guess you could also imagine it as the Babadook.
I have not seen the film, but I am familiar with the queer icon, the Babadook.
Yes,
so
the Babadook. Yeah.
Shout out. To
I
the
also,
Babadook.
yeah, I also actually have not seen it because I started in my adult age, developed into a wimp when it comes to
Yeah, I've
scary
just always
things.
been that. So, yep, that's why I never saw it. But I'm happy with the result where
Yeah.
the Babadook is.
Apparently, the movie is actually a really beautiful metaphor for grief. So
I'm sure
the
it
more you
is,
know.
but I will just let other people
But
have
you've
that
seen
experience.
the I know like the general premise is that it's this like children's storybook, and then like the Babadook like comes to life or something.
Right. Something like that.
Yeah. Again, just like with all the other people, Tom Bombadil tells the Bearer White to leave, and he does. And then I think that's kind of like the end of that. Then he on the next day he goes back to the river and calls up Goldberry.
Yep.
And this is the part where I'm like, maybe it hasn't aged well. So he went and caught the river daughter in green gown, flowing hair, sitting in the rushes, singing old water songs to birds upon the bushes. The bushes.
Yeah, it's one of those.
Anyway,
there are a
bushes,
couple of
whatever.
those. The old church rhyme thing where it's spelled the same, but it is not said. Like you can't rhyme again with refrain.
Yeah. But also worth noting, he is British. We are Americans,
yeah, okay.
so maybe
Yeah.
certain British dialects, other things rhyme when
Valid.
they don't with an American accent.
Of course.
Anyway, he caught her, held her fast. Water rats went scuttering. Reeds hissed, herons cried, and her heart went fluttering. So that's pretty alarming stuff. Context around like him getting her. It says he caught her,
Yeah.
and then reeds hissing, herons crying, and her heart is really beating fast. Not a great start.
I was confused because caught is certainly bad, but usually fluttering is good. So I had the back and forth of, does she want this? And we don't really hear from her until like the very end where she's like doing her hair or something. So yeah, I read this whole poem being like, is she cool with this? Like, I don't know. Can we get her side just to make sure? Because yeah, I had the same questions.
Yeah, so that's
I hope it's okay.
exactly. It's the kind of thing that I don't think when Tolkien was writing this, good God, nearly 100 years ago. That's crazy.
Yay!
Time is
Terrifying.
Time is bonkers. I don't think when he was writing this, he was like, I'm gonna have this be like subtly terrifying. I think he wrote this and was like, oh, how romantic.
Yeah.
So he says, here's my pretty maiden. You shall come home with me. The table is all laden. Yellow cream, honeycomb, white bread and butter, roses at the windowsill and peeping round the shutter. You shall come under hill. Never mind your mother. In her deep weedy pool, there you'll find no lover. So he does kind of paint a nice picture, like, hey, come to my house. I have like amazing food to eat. There's flowers everywhere. You're going to have a great time. Forget all about your mom. She's dead to you now.
Right. And again, this was like, let me hear from the other side. Does she hate her mom? So is this actually a really nice thing? Is her mother really rude? Maybe Tom's doing a great service.
And we don't know because the next line says, old Tom Bombadil had a merry wedding. So the context that we later have in Fellowship of the Ring when the hobbits encounter them is that they're having a pretty peaceful domestic life.
Good.
So
Okay,
it has a happy ending, and Goldberry seems to be very happy and loves Tom Bombadil and he loves her, but also like how much, agency was she given in the matter?
Let's hope a lot.
But yeah, towards the end, the poem ends with, hey, come, dairy dole, merry dole, my darling, sitting on the doorstep, chopping sticks of willow, while fair Goldberry combed her tresses yellow. Okay, yeah, willow and yellow definitely don't rhyme.
Nah. But as I was reading this, I was thinking, this is a very lengthy story that still does tell a coherent for the most part, story. So to have to rhyme every line, you can give a couple of passes.
It's pretty hard,
it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is the adventures of Tom Bombadil, and that is also kind of like the origin stories of Goldberry, and like how did Tom Bombadil, they didn't have, although Tom Bombadil for sure would have been on Bumble.
Oh, I mean, look,
bees,
right off the bat, when he was tickling those
anyway.
bees, I was like, power to you, man. I guess bumblebees aren't as dangerous, but, good for him.
I don't know if you're on TikTok at all, but sometimes I'll get videos of people like companies and people. It's like a like a save the bees kind of a thing, and they'll get calls to people's houses where it's like, hey, a swarm of bees have set up a hive in our like grill that we have outside that we haven't used. And so there are all these videos of them just like sometimes with like they use bare hands all the time, and they'll just like scoop up a pile of bees because they're looking for the queen bee.
Oh my goodness.
It's actually really fascinating, but they their goal is to like conserve and save the bees rather than like fumigating or killing them or something. So they'll like painstakingly break off as many pieces of the hive as possible and then like put it into a box and then just like with bare fucking hands grab up like a thing of bees. And I'm like, how do you not get stung? Like, so crazy. Yeah, super really impressive. Really impressive. Tom Bombadil actually would probably be all for that.
Hell yeah. He's all about
He would have a bee saving company, I feel like.
Completely.
And then the next little poem is Bombadil Goes Boating.
Yeah.
And again, kind of, like I said, kind of this theme of people like annoying Tom Bombadil and then him being like, why don't you leave me alone? And they're like, okay, I guess.
It seems like a common theme, and I wanted to make sure that that's actually what was happening and not me just having like poor reading comprehension. But I was like, it seems like this guy's life is getting captured by people that he doesn't want to be captured by. And then he says, please don't do that. And they go, oh, okay, yeah.
This poem was originally called the flighting of Tom Bombadil, Fliting. And flighting refers to a contest of insults, often in verse.
All right.
And I was like,
that makes sense.
Like context with this poem makes so much sense because it's a lot of him encountering people and then kind of like telling them off.
Yep.
And Tolkien later said about this, Tom's another word that I need to look up, rallery,
no idea.
Let me see, raillery, good-humored teasing. Okay, there we go.
Cool.
So Tom's raillery is here turned in jest upon his friends who treat it with amusement and then in parentheses tinged with fear. And I feel like the tinged with fear thing is really important.
Yeah, that's a key addition to put in there.
Yes. So it starts with Tom Bombadil being like, wow, what a beautiful day. I'm going to take advantage of this beautiful day. And he fixes up his boat and is like, I'm going to see where the river takes me. And we'll just, see what happens.
Yeah.
And along his journey, he is taunted by several creatures and people who are like, what are you doing? And Tom Bombadil's like, mind your own business.
Yep.
It starts off with a little bird who's like, I'm going to go tell Old Man Willow that you're leaving. And then Tom says, no names, you telltale, or I'll skin and eat you. Babbling in every ear things that don't concern you. If you tell Willow Man where I've gone, I'll burn you, roast you on a willow spit. That'll end your prying.
Yeah, that felt like a bit of an escalation.
Yeah, so that's where I kind of go back to this little quote from Tolkien who's like, yeah, he is turning this amusement upon his friends in jest. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like
I hope they understand this is their friendship love language because, when they said that, I was thinking, my goodness.
Yeah, it's pretty
and it's like right
violent.
at the beginning. I was like, Tom.
Yeah. So again, just that tinged with fear in parentheses. Absolutely love it.
It helps.
So then he is going down the river and he encounters a king's fisher.
Yep.
And somehow he acquires a tall, like from the fisher, I think he like dropped it or I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
A new tall blue feather that he uses for his hat. So this is important.
The origin story of the feather.
Yes, because Tolkien needed to explain, as he always does. He's like, if I don't put in every single little detail, this entire universe will fall apart.
Now I need to know the origin story of the yellow boots.
Right? Where did he? Yeah,
Come
exactly.
on.
So you'll notice that in the first poem, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, or maybe, yes, okay, I said it. I was like, or maybe you won't notice it if I didn't read it.
Right.
It describes that he is wearing his hat with a swan wing feather, but in The Fellowship of the Ring, his description of the hat has a tall blue feather.
Okay.
And Tolkien was like, I have to explain why he had a swan feather.
Amazing.
And why, after centuries of life, the feather might have changed.
Incredible.
So he replaces the feather on his hat with this tall blue feather. Oh, and actually also, you'll never hear so much background information about feather, but this is Tolkien. Originally, he wrote it as a peacock feather, but decided that a peacock would be too fantastical of a creature to be existing in Middle-earth. He didn't think it would make sense for a peacock to be in Middle-earth.
Okay, look, I've seen the movies, and I've also seen peacocks. And yes, they are magical, but I feel like they would fit in just fine.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the world has dragons, the world has balrogs, the world has elves. He draws the line at peacocks.
I don't know. I mean, I guess back in the day. So much color.
So he continues on down the river, and then some otters come swimming up, and they're like, where are you going? We're gonna, like, tip your boat over. And he's like, no, you're not. And then they swim away, and then he encounters a swan who appears to be the swan that he got his original feather from. And this swan is very pressed that he took one of his old feathers. Then he starts going into what's the name of this? I think it's Buckland is the area of the Shire that he is in. He's going down the Brandywine River, and he encounters some of the hobbits who live nearby, and they're all kind of like shouting at him from a distance, and they say, "Where, Tom? We'll shoot you dead with our bows and arrows. We don't let forest folk nor bogies." See, this is confusing for me because I just read Board of the Rings, which is a very raunchy parody. And the hobbits are called bogies.
That'll trip you. That'll trip you up.
So anyway, we don't let forest folk nor bogies from the Barrows cross over Brandywine by Cockleboat nor ferry. And then Tom fat shames them.
Not great, but you know,
Little
it's
fat
almost
bellies.
100 years old, so yeah.
Again, I like to think of the hobbits as being like pleasantly plump people rather than like being like, you little fat bellies, which is what Tolkien calls them. And he says, I'll call the orcs on you. That'll send you running. Also the use of the phrase, horny. Oh, I realized there's a typo in the link that I sent you. A horny goat. I first read that phrase, horny goat, and I forgot for a moment that goats have horns. I was
now when
confused.
I read horny goat, I thought of, and I don't know if you've ever been to a gas station in the southern United States, but they do have horny goat weed. which I just don't ever touch. It's like from those
Oh.
weird like dispensers where they have like funky, fun
I can't say I've
time
ever
stuff.
noticed that. And I live in the South, so
Yeah, it's just every now and then road trips you go in and it's like, do you want to buy some horny goat weed?
Horny goat
And it's,
weed?
no, I don't know what that's going to do to me, so I'm going to just pass on that.
that's a good judgment call. Yeah, good for you.
I think I've made some good choices.
That being said, the horny goat weed could also very well exist in the Shire.
Right, but at least that,
You know?
if in that context, I would feel like it would be fun and cool and stuff, and they would put in their pipes and, whatever, but not in a grimy bathroom in Texas.
Yeah, agreed. Hard agree. So Tom Bombadil kind of like laughs them off, but we later learn that they did shoot him because he has arrows stuck in his hat.
Yes.
So again, I call into question this, lighthearted teasing amongst friends that
Who
Tolkien
amongst us
says.
has not fired out? Maybe they're incredibly good shots, and they were like, we'll hit him just in the hat. We're that good of aim that we're not actually going to fire projectiles at our dear friend Tom Bombadil.
Yeah. So then he gets out of his boat and reaches land, and he runs into Farmer Maggot, who is also a character in the Lord of the Rings. I think in the movies, Pippin and Merry run into Sam and Frodo because they have been stealing from Farmer Maggot's farm.
Okay.
I think that's his appearance in the movies. And then in the book, I think they just kind of run into him and they're like, directions to Mordor? And he's like, I don't know, but maybe try the forest or something. So Farmer Maggot is like, Tom is like, what, you don't recognize your old friend? And then invites Tom to his house with the rest of his family. And they have a pretty good party, it sounds like. Lots of singing and dancing and drinking.
Fun times.
Yeah. And then Tom and Farmer Maggot have a conversation. And then the next morning, Farmer Maggot wakes up and Tom is gone. And there's no trace of him because the rain has come and washed away his footprints and stuff. And so it's the kind of thing where it's like, did I just hallucinate that all of that happened? Was that real? And with Tom Bombadil, you never know.
Never. You can never tell. It's so magical. It could be a whole thing. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a later thing and it was just anything that ever happened with Tom Bombadil was all a dream. And you just kind of have to be like, yeah, checks out.
Yeah. And so Tom Bombadil has disappeared without a trace. His boat stays in the river where he had gotten out. And eventually, after a couple days, the otters and the swan drag it back into the river. And eventually they know that Tom will come back and find the boat. And that is the end of Bombadil Goes Boating.
Yep. Okay, good. I'm glad that you recapped the plot. And I am confirmed in what I thought was, did a whole lot happen? And the answer is, nah.
No.
Again, I was worried that my reading comprehension skills were slipping, but nah, it's just...
No, you do in fact know how to
poem.
read. Yeah. Yeah.
It's good. It was very reassuring. I'm glad. This is really therapeutic for me.
And so now we have finished our dive into the Bombadil cinematic universe.
Oh, love it. Oh, man. So good. And you know what? It's funny because they are obviously making more and more Lord of the Rings stuff, and they've announced they're going to make new movies, and they're doing the prequel thing and all of these other sorts of things. Eventually, I feel like they're going to do it. Eventually, they're going to do the gritty Tom Bombadil adaptation.
And actually, that does remind me, I wanted to mention earlier that as it stands, the only time that we have seen Tom Bombadil on a screen in a cinematic or a film adaptation is in the 1990s Soviet era adaptations of Lord of the Rings.
Wow. Okay.
It's a fever dream, and I didn't expect anything less from Soviet era like made for
Amazing.
TV, Lord of the Rings.
This makes me think of how the only instance, aside from the books of Ludo Bagman in the Harry Potter universe, is the PlayStation 2 Quidditch Through the Ages video game. It's the only visual representation that we get of him. So you just get this weird semi-pixelated PlayStation 2 graphics polygon version of him. And that's just like, aside from I think the illustrated versions of the books, like before they released those for a long time, that was the only canonical representation of this man outside of the books.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I would love to see Tom Bombadil be adapted by Amazon or Warner Brothers.
Let's go. Let's go. Let's make it happen.
I do believe it was just recently announced that there is going to be a new set of Magic the Gathering cards in their Lord of the Rings.
Ooh.
And the art has been released for a lot of them, and it's like really wonderful because the art shows that Aragorn is black, and I think they also made Eowyn black.
Fun. Let's go.
So like that's great, and also it's really beautiful. But I was also like, where's the Tom Bombadil card? I know nothing about, absolutely nothing about Magic the Gathering.
Mm-hmm. But give me the card. Give me the card anyway.
Give me the Tom Bombadil card. Does it make you win everything?
I would imagine, but only if you care. Only if you truly care, which he doesn't.
That's true. Actually, I bet the card is like, this character could help you to win this entire game, but is useless.
Sure, yeah. This card would help you, but he doesn't feel like it. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that's where we stand on the Bombadil adaptations. Yeah, the end. Again, like I've said, you now know as much about Tom Bombadil as the Lord of the Rings fandom.
This is great. This is very good. I feel alive. I feel wiser, and I'm glad that I can now bring this information into the universe,
right,
and finally contribute to society.
Yes, exactly. I was very glad to be able to visit these poems finally, because when I was doing my first read through and you encounter Tom Bombadil, you're like, who is this man? And there's such a vague explanation. And then people said, oh, well, there's a poem called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And I was like, oh, I can't wait to do that. Maybe I'll have more insight into this character. I'll learn more about him. And sure, we read them.
Yeah, we did. We did. Look at us go.
So I feel confident saying that like I officially did as deep a dive into Tom Bombadil, which was my original goal. So
check.
I can now end the podcast. This is the last episode.
Happy to be a part of it. Let's ride off into the sunset wearing yellow boots.
Yes. Mike, thank you so much for joining me for this silliness and everything. Where can people find you on the internet?
Oh, a whole bunch of places. You can find me, the person, on my personal website, which is Schubs, schub.es. That's where you can learn about some of the podcasts that I make, such as The Newest Olympian, which is a Percy Jackson podcast, or Meddling Adults, which is a podcast for charity where we do a competition to see who can solve mysteries from Scooby-Doo and Encyclopedia Brown and classics like that. Got old episodes of Potterless as well. Horse, if you like funny basketball stuff, and Modern Muckraker, if you want something very different, where I did a scripted investigative journalism show and asked hard-hitting questions such as, when should Spider-Man take the subway instead of web swinging? So you can learn all about that on my website. And then if you want to find me, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Schubes17, so SCHUBES17.
Awesome. I think it's a very valiant effort that you are, that you have a podcast dedicated to those mysteries, such as Encyclopedia Brown, because I babysit a third grader who, she is very smart, and she was reading Harry Potter like in first grade and in kindergarten, and she reads Encyclopedia Brown, and whenever I go over, we read a story, and then she asks me to solve it, and I'm like,
they're so fun. Encyclopedia Brown mysteries are so fun because it's all just one tiny detail, and that makes reading them such an interesting endeavor, because anything could be the reason that the entire case gets cracked by Encyclopedia Brown, or it could just be a fun flavor text and you never really know what is the actual little thing. And it's so fun. Those books are phenomenal. Can't recommend them enough. They're such a joy. They're such a joy. And then you can learn weird information because some of the solutions are just, yeah, you're just supposed to know that ducks don't have esophaguses. And that's why the person who said he brought a duck to space was lying.
Oh, man. That sounds very much like the podcast that is one of my favorites, Hey Riddle Riddle.
A classic. And we've had them on Meddling Adults. So boom, full
circle. Oh my God, perfect.
There you go.
But yeah, it's that same like contempt for riddles where it's like, how was I supposed to know that? That's not fair. So That's What I'm Talking About's cover art is by Vaishon Brandon. You can support him on Instagram at Vaishon Designs. You can get merch for That's What I'm Talking About by going to tpublic.com/user/talkingaboutpod. You can follow the podcast on social media at talkingaboutpod, and you can follow me on Twitter at MCWhatsup and on Instagram at MCTurndownForWhat. If you want to support That's What I'm Talking About, you can become a patron. Go to patreon.com/talkingaboutpod to explore the different levels of support that are available. As always, you can join any level that is so meaningful and special to me that you would want to show your support for this podcast. But as always, there's a little extra love for our sponsors, such as this week's sponsor, who's brand new, Candace. Candace, thank you so much for becoming a patron and for wanting to support That's What I'm Talking About. Whether you are listening to this now because you listen to the episodes as they come out, or you're listening to this years in the future when you have finally caught up with everything because you started from the beginning, I appreciate your support. It really means so much. And as always, if you like what you're listening to, please make sure to rate and review. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any parting words for the audience?
My parting words would be, whenever times are tough and you need a spark of joy in your life, just pull up the scene in The Two Towers where Legolas skateboards down the stairs on his shield, because it's the greatest scene in all of cinema and it will never be topped ever by anything in the world. It's so good. It's so mid-2000s. It's perfect. I love it so much.
And that's what I'm talking about.